Welcome back to the deep dive, where we take these incredibly detailed procedural documents and try to pull out what you actually need to know.
And today we are deep in the paperwork trenches.
We really are. We're in the Manual of Patent Examining Procedure, the MPP. And we're not talking about the fun stuff like patent eligibility. We're talking about the sheer administrative grind of keeping a patent you've already been granted alive.
That's right. We are focused squarely on probably the most overlooked but potentially catastrophic topic in patent law: maintenance fees. Specifically, we're drilling down into MPP Chapter 2500, which is all about maintenance fees, and then an even tinier section, MPP Section 2530.
And that's called Special Acceptance of Maintenance Fee Payments Containing Informalities.
Informalities. It's such a polite word, isn't it?
It really is. It basically means you messed up the paperwork, but crucially, you didn't mess up the money. So our mission today is to understand this peculiar safety net, how the USPTO handles payments that were on time for the right amount, but had these little clerical errors, a typo in a patent number, a mismatch, something like that.
And it's fascinating because it forces the USPTO into making an administrative judgment call. The system admits that, humans make mistakes, but then it demands perfect accountability right after.
A flexible framework with razor-sharp teeth. I like that.
It is.
So let's unpack the high stakes here. I mean, why does this matter so much?
Well, before we even get into the nitty-gritty of acceptance rules, you have to remember what these fees are for.
Right.
Maintenance fees are required at 3 non-negotiable points: after 4, 8, and 12 years from the grant date. If you miss that window, your patent just dies.
Goof, gone.
Period. And this applies to patents from applications filed on or after December 12, 1980. So basically all modern patents.
And the cost isn't trivial, especially as the patent gets older. But there is a key point here for smaller players, right?
Yeah.
Some financial relief.
Absolutely. This is one of the biggest incentives to classify yourself correctly. Maintenance fees get a massive 60% reduction for small entities.
60%.
If you're a startup or an independent inventor, making sure you claim that status correctly can literally save you thousands of dollars.
Okay, so we've got a big payment, huge stakes, and a very strict deadline. Now let's talk about how you pay. If you're not using the electronic system, which, let's be honest, is the safest way to go,
The absolute safest.
and you're using mail or fax, the risk just goes way up.
It really does. The USPTO is very clear on this. If you're submitting physically, you have to include a current telephone number and a mailing address.
Why is that so critical?
Because if they find one of these informalities, they need a way to contact you immediately. They need to be able to call and say, hey, what did you mean here?
So they can clear up the ambiguity before the payment window closes.
Exactly. And, we don't need to get into the weeds on things like the certificate of mailing rule, but the bottom line is, if you file by mail or fax, you have to be meticulous about proving when you sent it. If you can't, and there's a problem, you might have no recourse at all.
Okay, so that brings us to the core of this whole section, special acceptance.
Right. This is the procedure. It's this sort of administrative leap of faith the USPTO takes. The submission is defective, maybe you left off an application number, but, and this is the key, the payment itself is sufficient and timely.
So the intent to pay is there, the check clears, it arrived on time, but the label on the envelope is smudged, so to speak.
A perfect analogy. So what do?
What happens next?
They immediately fire off a warning shot. When a payment is specially accepted, the office sends out the Notice of Special Acceptance of Patent Maintenance Fee.
Okay.
We should really call it the 60-day clock warning.
The 60-day clock warning, I like that.
Because that's what it is. It's Form PTO 2143.
And this form, this PTO 2143, it's basically the patent owner's wake-up call.
Precisely. The notice tells you exactly which patent and application number the USPTO thinks your fee belongs to. And, most importantly, it explicitly asks you to confirm. They're saying, we put your money here, check our work. If we got it wrong, you need to tell us now.
Wow. So that completely shifts the burden. They give you the benefit of the doubt on the initial mistake, but then they immediately put the responsibility on you to verify their fix.
100%. The grace period is over the second that notice is mailed.
Okay, so to really get how this works, we need to walk through the specific scenarios the MPP lays out. Because how the USPTO reacts really depends on what information you gave them or didn't give them.
Let's start with scenario 1. This is the simplest. You provided the patent number, the ultimate ID, but you left off the application number.
In that case, the patent number should be enough, right? I mean, that's the final identifier.
Usually, yes. The office has 2 pretty simple options here. Either apply the payment directly to the patent you identify or just return the payment to you.
And they'll almost always just apply it, I assume.
If the patent number is clean and unambiguous, yes. They'll prioritize the final granted identifier.
Okay, now it gets tricky. Scenario 2. You give them both the patent number and the application number, but they don't match. They belong to two different patents, maybe both in your portfolio. How do they break that tie?
The default rule is that the patent number wins.
The patent number wins.
They'll apply the payment to the patent identified by the patent number.
And what's the logic there?
Well, the patent number is the more concrete, the more enduring identifier of that specific property right. The application number is just a precursor. Once that patent is granted, its number is king.
So the application number is sort of legacy data at that point.
In this context, yes. But there is an exception.
I figured there would be.
The office might return the payment or reassign it if other information in the submission, like the name of the person sending it, a client reference number, even the letterhead, if all of that stuff strongly contradicts the patent number they were given.
So they're looking for internal consistency. If everything else screams patent B, but you wrote down patent A, they'll pause.
Exactly. It's just basic risk management for them. They don't want to apply a fee incorrectly if they can help it.
That makes sense. Okay, final scenario. The riskiest one. You only provide the application number and you leave off the patent number.
This is the weakest kind of submission. But the payment may still be applied if, and this is a big if there's enough corroborating information to support it.
What on earth counts as corroborating information? That sounds really subjective.
It is, but it's defined by context. The best example they give is about the sender's info. Let's say the name and address of the person sending the fee is a perfect match for the official address of record for the patent that's tied to that application number.
I see.
In that case, the office might rely on that. They can connect the money to the person who is officially listed as being responsible for that patent.
And if that link isn't there, or it's weak?
Then the payment gets returned, which honestly is probably the safest outcome for everyone. It forces you to just resubmit it correctly.
Okay, so now we shift into the really high-stakes part of this.
Yeah.
Let's say you get that PTO 2143, the 60-day clock warning in the mail,
Mm-hmm.
and you look at it and realize, oh no, they did apply it to the wrong patent. This has to happen all the time with big law firms paying hundreds of these fees at once.
It does. It's a common mistake.
So what's the move? What do you do right now?
You have to immediately file a petition to get it corrected.
A petition.
Typically, this would be a petition under 37 CFR 1.377. It's just a simple administrative fix. You're just asking them, hey, can you please move this money from patent A over to patent B?
And the time frame for that, you called it the 60-day clock.
And that clock is non-negotiable. You must file that petition within 2 months of the mailing date on that notice of special acceptance.
2 months. That is
Okay.
shockingly fast for any kind of major administrative action.
It is.
If a docketing clerk is on vacation or the notice gets lost in the mailroom, you could easily miss that. Why is it so aggressive, especially after the USPTO was so flexible up front?
It's all about minimizing ambiguity. The USPTO cannot have a patent's life or death status just hanging in limbo. They gave you a break, but now they demand immediate accountability.
And if you miss that 2-month window?
The petition will almost certainly be dismissed, and at that point, the patent you meant to pay for could officially lapse.
So if the patent owner misses that deadline, petition gets dismissed. Is the patent just dead? Is there any last resort?
The patent is potentially dead, yes. And your problem just went from a simple administrative fix to a major financial and legal crisis.
Wow.
Your next step is to pursue relief under a different rule, 37 CFR 1.378.
Okay, so what's the practical difference between a 1.377 petition and a 1.378 petition?
The cost and the burden of proof. The 1.377 petition is simple paperwork to correct an error the office already flagged for you. The fee is pretty low.
And 1.378?
Moving to 1.378 means you have to petition to revive an expired patent based on unintentionally delayed payment. This is a much more complex, much more expensive procedure. It requires a ton of documentation, a sworn statement that the delay was truly unintentional. It's a huge undertaking.
That is a massive leap in difficulty. You've gone from proving a simple clerical error to having to justify the death of your patent.
Absolutely. The difference between those two rules is the difference between a small accounting issue and a potential malpractice suit.
And this kind of rigidity, these 2-month clocks, they're all over the MPP, aren't they?
All over the place. Even if you try to get your dismissed 1.377 petition reconsidered, that request for reconsideration is also often subject to a 2-month, non-extendable deadline. Once that clock starts, the USPTO means business.
So this deep dive into just one small section, MPP Section 2530, it really shows us a paradox.
It does.
On one hand, the USPTO creates this special acceptance mechanism that's designed to be a flexible safety net to protect you from being unfairly punished for a small mistake.
Yes, but that safety net is attached to a procedural tripwire. The second that PTO 2143 notice goes in the mail, you, the patent owner, are put on the fastest, most rigid clock in the entire patent system.
It really underscores that while the office might allow for a little human error up front, the accountability they demand right after is absolutely non-negotiable.
I mean, it's just remarkable when you think about it. This level of detail, this precision, all dedicated to these tiny scenarios. What if the application number is missing? What if they mismatch? It just proves that managing a patent portfolio isn't just about the technology. It's a marathon of rigorous, constant administrative vigilance.
It truly is. The sheer number of roles, just about getting the identifying numbers right, it teaches a huge lesson.
It really does. I think the final thought here is that when you're managing intellectual property that's worth millions, MPEP Section 2530 shows us that your most dangerous enemy often isn't your competitor.
It's your own internal administrative mistakes.
Especially when that 2-month clock is ticking.
A truly provocative thought to end on. Thank you for walking us through the fine print on this one.
My pleasure, as always.
And that's all the time we have for this deep dive. Of course, this summary, like the others in our MPA series, was prepared with the help of AI tools like ChatGPT and Notebook LM, and it may have errors. It's really for educational purposes only.
Right. It is definitely not legal advice. For anything official, you should always consult the actual MPE or a registered patent practitioner.
We also want to give a special thank you to our creative director, Mike Shepard, who organized this entire audio series.
Yes, thank you, Mike.
We'll be back next time with another close look at the source material you need to know.